All right, thank you. So we'll dive right in. So just a brief
Caleb,
overview.
are you able to go into like a slideshow mode? I don't know if anyone else has had sees it. If everyone sees it fine, it just kind of showed up kind of
Is
where
it
you
not,
can see the yeah,
it's not full screen?
it's not full screen for us.
This is presenter view
Oh, okay.
on Google Slides. So sorry for like the extra large margins. Um, but yeah, I'll go ahead and get us into the agenda. So first, I'll briefly go over the Extreme Heat Coalition as a whole, our membership, and some background information about how it came to be. I'll talk about some context around the impacts of extreme heat um, and the climate context. And then we're only going to cover a few recommendations per city and state. Um, and later today, when the full policy agenda is released, you'll be able to get more into the details and the full extent of the strategies that we recommend. And then we'll open up to discussion in the Q&A. All right. So launched in 2023, the Extreme Heat Coalition was born as an extension of WEAC's Heat Health and Equity Initiative, which started in 2019. It started as a 3-year program to find solutions to extreme heat and the forces of inequity to make the heat more dangerous for environmental justice communities. In New York in particular, Black residents die at 2 times the rate of their white neighbors from heat exacerbated illness. And so there was a serious sense of urgency to expand our advocacy here. And in particular, the initiative was pivotal to the early stages of our LIHEAP advocacy and our climate justice working group led cooling center audit. We're pursuing New York City, state, and federal legislation to address the deadly impact of extreme heat driven by climate change. And even as WEACT has been a steadfast and outspoken voice for more proactive and holistic extreme heat adaptation, we saw an opportunity to band together with organizations shining a light on similar policy gaps across the environmental, academic, social justice, and housing justice sectors. Our member organizations also include South Bronx Unite, Earth Justice, Natural Resources Defense Council, New York Disaster Interface Services, Central and Southeast Brooklyn CDC, Groundwork Hudson Valley Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, Natural Areas Conservancy, Climate Change Makers of Brooklyn, and Waterfront Alliance. All of these organizations have joined in a collective mission to eliminate health disparities amongst the most heat vulnerable urban residents who are disproportionately low income and people of color. So for some context, extreme heat is the deadliest impact of climate change. This graphic from the World Health Organization shows how some of the symptoms show up on a really personal level, like what the symptoms are in the body and sort of amplifying factors of extreme heat, but also some broader system-wide impacts that we might observe. So you might see health, you might see symptoms of extreme heat-related illness and dehydration, dizziness, fainting, and mortality. There are also populations that are especially vulnerable because of physiological, environmental, social, occupational, and medical reasons. And many New Yorkers find themselves in this intersection of 2 or more of these vulnerability indicators. seniors, young children, outdoor workers, pregnant people, people with respiratory, cardiac, renal, and certain mental health conditions are disproportionately affected by these heat-related health outcomes. And that's why creating more resilient neighborhoods and improving resident preparedness will become increasingly important to prevent health system and infrastructure failures as exposure to excessive heat grows more frequent and intense. By 2050, our days over 90 could reach into the 50s and 60s per year. So thinking about cumulatively 2 months of excessive heat represents a serious danger. And that's why we need to be really forward thinking and aggressive in implementing strategies to mitigate heat mortality. So why is New York in particular so vulnerable to heat mortality? For one, in major cities, the urban heat island effect is a phenomenon wherein the density of building materials like concrete, glass, they all trap and radiate heat out over long periods of time, as opposed to more natural areas that much more effectively disperse heat. And so New York City is the most dense, the most intense heat island in the country. And this is also amplified by the high cost of energy, where we are still fairly reliant on fossil fuels. The distribution cost of energy is fairly high, and we have housing stock that has various barriers to innovative and cost-saving rate design. So that puts a higher burden on residents who need access to cooling. There's also various cumulative impacts. Oh, actually, before I move on to that point, this graphic here from the NPCC4 report shows a rising trend of heat deaths at temperatures lower than the heat advisory threshold. And that really points to a trend of long periods of heat exposure with limited access to cooling as a driving factor of heat mortality. And in addition, in major cities, you have so much different kinds of land use bumping up against each other, particularly for disadvantaged communities. That means high proximity to various sources of pollution, toxics, pests in the home, and various factors that contribute to chronic respiratory issues like asthma. Northern Manhattan and the South Bronx have some of the highest asthma rates in the entire country. And then, of course, the legacy of redlining are those social inequities that we're pointing to. It is everywhere in the built environment, where there's lower access to green space, the lower quality housing stock that I mentioned, as well as impaired access to health services and economic opportunities all influence heat vulnerability. So to kick off our city recommendations, just for some context, these are some priorities that we've presented and refined with research and community feedback over the last year. To kick us off, I'm inviting Rona Taylor, the Executive Director of Central Southeast Brooklyn CDC, Her organization was founded to amplify the voices of Central and Southeast Brooklyn residents to build communities that nurture their minds, bodies, and environments by prioritizing equity and justice in care, including physical, mental, maternal, and environmental health. Rona, take it away.
Great. So, my apologies, just give me 1 second. So, yes, Caleb asked me to talk a little bit about cooling centers, and this is a particular interest to me because of the impacts of the urban heat island effect has on residents in East Flatbush in particular. So, here you see the cool options map, which allows for residents to become familiar with where the locations are. Unfortunately, these locations do not address many of the issues raised by residents and the city controller's office. And with no allocated budget or protection in the city charter, underserved areas could be disproportionately impacted by fiscal priorities of future administrations. And so last year's 5% program to eliminate the gap resulted in closures on Sundays across the public library system. And this will significantly limit non-age restricted access to cooling centers in the event of heat emergencies over the weekends. And so what we need is, one, is to set a minimum number of centers based on where heat vulnerable populations reside. Also, require locations that receive funding to serve as a cooling center to be open for every heat advisory. Require locations that receive funding to serve as a cooling center to put up appropriate signage and train staff in how to identify heat-related illness. Have designated cooling centers that have extended hours, including evenings and weekends when many are currently closed. And finally, to provide programming at cooling center locations to make them more desirable places to visit. So East Flatbush has only 2 cooling centers per 100,000 people, which is the fewest available amongst the top 10 most heat vulnerable neighborhoods. And of the 2, 1 is for seniors only. So everyone else actually only has access to 1 cooling center. And in looking at the intersection of heat and climate change among residents in East Flatbush that have conditions of obesity and hypertension and cardiovascular disease, it's upwards of like 30%, like close to 40% of the residents of East Flatbush have these pre-existing conditions, and these, heat-related mortality is more likely to happen in the presence of these pre-existing conditions. And lastly, I would just say that although, according to the most recent health profiles published by DOHMH, which I believe was in 2019, stated that 84% of residents had access to working air conditioning in East Flatbush. One survey showed that New Yorkers, about 24% infrequently or never use their air conditioners because of utility bill costs. So even though people may have access to working air conditioners, they may not be able to afford to use them. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Caleb.
Thank you, Rona. There we go. So in addition to those adaptation measures through the city's Office of Emergency Management, like the cooling centers, we also just need to combat the urban heat island effect, and expanding access to green spaces and nature-based solutions is a major tool that we need to see implemented more broadly. So local law 148, for context, is a law that was passed last year. It requires the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice and the Department of Parks and Recreation to coordinate with various municipal agencies and other stakeholders to reach a 30% canopy cover goal. All this while prioritizing expansion into the most climate impacted neighborhoods with the lowest canopy cover, collecting LiDAR data to track progress every 5 years, include an outreach strategy to educate property owners by providing them with information and strategies on how to advance the goals set in the plan, and expanding the number of trees located on their property. And this is already quite a lot to do, but the Parks Department has to execute it with less than 1% of the city's budget. So the Extreme Heat Coalition, alongside many other organizations and coalitions like Forest for All, NYC, New Yorkers for Parks, 1% for Parks, and Playfair, all of these coalitions have been calling for 1% allocation that would put the Parks Department in a much more advantageous position. And as you can see, park staff already spends so much of its money on maintenance. Just tree planting alone isn't what's going to give us the cooling benefits that we need. Much of it relies upon a mature canopy being there, as we have much more long and oppressive exposures to extreme heat. Excuse me. In addition to that, the Parks Department is the lead agency responsible for connecting over 300 miles of nature trails, creating nature-based stormwater management solutions, and investing in the New York City Green Infrastructure Program, as well as creating over 10 acres of new open space. So it will take additional staff time and new communication and management protocols to develop robust community engagement process across agencies and identify incentives to offer property owners in the stewardship of trees on their property. And while education is an essential step, the city should expect that property owners are gonna want incentives. Tree maintenance can be expensive, and without resources to make preservation of mature trees easier, there's way too much left to chance. Trees on private land comprise 35% of urban canopy currently, where we have 22% canopy cover, and 68% of land cover available for practical canopy is privately owned. Attempts to protect mature trees can't be our only mechanism. As we saw previously, Introduction 259 from 2022 failed. So aside from just restrictive measures, we also need to see City Council and city leadership explore alternatives that encourage good behaviors. And likewise, community members who don't own land are also a key group to engage, since they can be trusted messengers to property owners that government may have a harder time reaching due to eroded trust for systemic reasons, and also drive political will at various levels of government to invest in resilience and aid in the co-design of programs. We also support legislation to introduce an indoor maximum temperature law. And we do have staff from Councilmember Ressler's office, who is currently in the drafting process, introducing this legislation. An indoor maximum temperature is something that has been expressed as a high priority in Plan YC, and We ACT has advocated for it in previous iterations of our extreme heat policy agenda as well. We're past due to assert access to cooling as a right as opposed to a luxury. And there already is an understanding in New York City building code that temperature control is an essential part of safe housing. New York City building code has a minimum temperature threshold in the winter. Landlords have to ensure tenants have access to heating to maintain a temperature of at least 62 degrees once the temperature outdoors fall below 55 degrees. Now that New York City is a humid subtropical zone, we just need to mirror this standard with cooling protections. And as we move forward with this, we want the bill to make sure that it prioritizes health, energy efficiency, tenant rights, and education. We want to see a temperature threshold introduced that prevents the multitude of disruptions from heat stress that are often underestimated. Cognitive impairment, worsened asthma symptoms, and poor quality sleep are all associated with heat stress, and they can all occur at temperatures well below the heat advisory threshold. And even in the event of non-extreme heat temperatures or heat advisories, temperatures indoors without access to cooling can continue to rise even as ambient temperatures start to decrease. Especially for heat vulnerable tenants who rely on medical devices or have mobility impairments that make it harder for them to leave their apartments, cooling at home is all the more important for them to thrive. As Rona mentioned, even though there are citywide, the average for air conditioning access is high, that doesn't mean that everyone has access to air conditioning in good repair. And so landlords should also help shoulder the burden of maintenance and making sure that air conditioning is installed properly so that the most energy efficient air conditioning is delivered to tenants. And once its protection is passed, we need to be exhaustive in tenant education about its existence. There are other jurisdictions that have cooling requirements in other parts of the US, but many of them have largely not warmed nearly as rapidly in recent years as our region. And so this represents a major paradigm shift in tenants' rights for New York City, especially. Here, we're conditioned to think of New York as a cold weather state, and without proper outreach, residents will not know to expect this as a responsibility from landlords. And one other thing I want to note about this is that because cooling is facilitated through electricity use, which is often covered separately and not included in the rent as heating costs is, more commonly, companion legislation will definitely strengthen this bill's capacity to protect residents from dangerous indoor temperatures without increasing their energy burden. So separately, we have WEACT has been advocating on the state level for New York Heat, as well as other bills that seek to cap energy burden at 6%. And this kind of protection is indispensable because a growing portion of heat deaths are occurring in apartments where residents either lack or do not turn on their air conditioning because it's too expensive. All right, so we're going to get into some of the state recommendations. I mentioned at the top of the presentation that WEACT has been really engaged in LIHEAP advocacy, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. And while we are working to get more funding for LIHEAP at the federal level, we need the state administrator of LIHEAP, the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, or OTDA for short. We need them to authorize the use of the cooling assistance benefit to cover the cost of utility bills. The Department of Public Service estimates the average summer utility bill to cost about $207. And while this figure represents a 3% decrease from the average bill cost this time last year, still 1 in 4 New Yorkers are already energy burdened. And while the current uses of the cooling assistance benefit should be continued, when people have the option to apply it to utility bills, it'll encourage folks to make sure that they are using their air conditioner to the extent that they are at a safe temperature within their homes, while they currently cannot afford to. And then another part of this, from sort of a long-term planning and data transparency and advocacy perspective, is that we need OTDA to report how its administration of funds is actually reducing home energy costs, which is a LIHEAP assurance. And this has not been information that's been included in the state draft plans for the past few years. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but we should be seeking to make sure that LIHEAP administration is in alignment with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that has an equity mandate, making sure, and Justice 40, that disadvantaged communities are receiving investment in energy, climate, or receiving 35 to 40% of those investments. So tracking where LIHEAP, what percentage of LIHEAP eligible households are receiving benefits in disadvantaged communities, the programs they are applying for, and the extent to which that service level supports CLCPAs would be a welcome step to really make sure that we're following that North Star outlined in the CLCPA and Justice 40. So we also are looking towards revising the warranty of habitability, which is the statewide standard for safe and habitable housing. This has a number of provisions, including heat, including access to water and hot water, all things that make for a thermally safe home, and including cooling in the warranty of habitability would eliminate the need for every city to go and make its own indoor maximum temperature policy and just make it a baseline for all housing in New York. But also, this would protect the most heat vulnerable tenants who need energy efficiency retrofits, electrical upgrades, and heat pump installations in their buildings, access to long-term affordable and sustainable cooling options. But currently, since cooling is not a housing requirement, landlords are entitled to raise the rent under New York state law, since these are considered major capital improvements or individual apartment improvements. When already overburdened tenants face these kinds of rent increases, they often can no longer afford their apartments and have to leave. And so the state should revise the warranty of habitability standard to ensure that the structural costs associated with providing it are not passed on to tenants. Simultaneously, the state should pursue steeper incentives for landlords that can be braided with federal supports to ease compliance, starting with the most heat vulnerable disadvantaged communities. So we have also been joining the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health and various unions in support of the TEMP Act, which is the Temperature Extreme Mitigation Program Act, introduced by Senator Jessica Ramos. This bill covers agriculture, construction, landscaping, delivery, and food service industries, as well as car wash workers, making sure that they have access to thermal safety both indoors and outdoors and in vehicles. And while OSHA is undergoing a process to set a temperature threshold, it is very slow and arduous, and the time horizon for that is still unknown and unclear. And so while we are working on this, we need these protections at the state level to ensure that all employees have a right to work in safe temperatures and are provided with resources and accommodations to prevent heat-related illness, including hydration stations provided by their employers, 10-minute paid rest breaks, acclimatization periods, personal protective equipment, access to air conditioning, heat safety training, multilingual signage and educational materials, as well as whistleblower protections, especially given that many workers who do not have citizenship status are more vulnerable to worker exploitation and are not emboldened to speak up when they're being abused in this way. And then lastly, I want to touch on New Efficiency New York, which is an initiative by the Public Service Commission directing the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority and utilities to drive strategic investment into programs that will move the state toward its energy efficiency goal of saving 185 TBTU by 2025. And NENI for short is subject to the state's commitment, the CLCPA commitment that I mentioned earlier. But interim reports have shown that the current rate at which energy efficiency investments and building electrification technologies are being deployed, or that it's not going to meet the energy savings goal by 2025. And within that, low to moderate income and disadvantaged communities in particular struggle most to access energy efficiency programs. This can be attributed to a variety of factors, including funding restrictions, systemic disinvestment in communities of color, and barriers to homeownership. For example, homeowners in formerly redlined neighborhoods are far behind the starting line when it comes to energy efficiency upgrades because they've historically had less access to capital to keep their homes in good repair. Expanding funding available for mold, mildew remediation, roof repair, leaks, and other health and safety issues or repairs in the building envelope would help bridge the gap for low-income homeowners. And this would also really be complemented by the passage of the Green Affordable Pre-Electrification Fund Act as well. And another issue that has been sort of a barrier for applicants trying to benefit from these programs is that the application processes are very time intensive and require a lot of expertise and are decentralized. So a way to address this issue would be to create a common application across energy affordability programs, which would be co-designed by applicants, community-based organizations, and contractors. That way, the applications could sort of avoid common application mistakes, which tend to increase the cost and time to implement these technologies. So now we can pause there. I'll stop my screen share. I want to check and see if Councilmember Wrestler is on. He could speak a little bit more about the drafting process of the indoor maximum temperature. I'll pause really quickly. Okay, maybe he'll join in a little bit later. But yeah, now I can open the floor to questions and responses. And I'll also check and see if there were any submitted through the Q&A. Oh, awesome. Okay, I saw some were answered already in the Q&A section.
Yeah, Caleb, I answered a couple that were in the Q&A, but I can kind of go through if anyone, just to highlight some of those if you want me to.
Yeah, I appreciate that, LJ.
One of the questions was, what source of info on neighborhood heat vulnerability does the city currently use to target efforts toward the most heat vulnerable neighborhood, like tree planting, establishing minimum numbers of cooling centers, et cetera? And the response there is that there are a lot of options, a lot of data that can be used in this way, but I think the New York City Environmental Health and Data Portal, heat vulnerability, is probably the most likely source that agencies have to use the data, but it's unsure how agencies use this to implement programs and policies themselves. But we always do encourage whether it be legislators or city agencies to kind of utilize this data to equitably implement anything that they're doing. So if they're thinking about putting investments or money towards something, or increasing or enhancing a program, that they utilize this, because the heat vulnerability index really is a great index and source and kind of data point to really capture a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about extreme heat as it relates to environmental and climate justice. And then Caleb, I'll pass this one question to you if you want to. I did give a quick kind of generic answer, but how can folks get active / show up / support in these efforts?
Yeah, so we will be, thank you for registering for this. We will be in contact with folks that are in our distribution list for other events over the course of the cooling season, whether it be for a community workshop or other events. We'll reach out and keep you posted. And I mentioned later today, we will have the policy agenda available. So reviewing that and offering your feedback. I can also just put my contact here in the chat because we're an open door and our policy is driven by community needs. So would love to hear any additional thoughts at any time, but we will definitely share upcoming opportunities to engage.
Looks like there's another question in the Q&A.
Yeah, I thought I saw a question. Okay, so I see regarding tree canopy coverage, are there anti-displacement measures as well as to prevent green gentrification? That's a great question. I don't think in the language of the bill, there's specifically something that prevents green gentrification, but I think in the community engagement process, that's where residents will be able to contribute elements that actually protect against that. And I know, especially in New York City, we're very sensitive to that because the High Line is always touted as an example of how that can go wrong. So I think definitely as the local law 148 community engagement process rolls out, that's kind of the way to plug in. And then I see another question, but I actually saw Councilmember Wrestler just joined. So let me see if I can find him. Are you able to unmute?
I'm here, Caleb. How are you doing? Thank you so much
Welcome.
for having me. I really appreciate the chance to say hello and to be with you all. And it's good to see LJ, and I'm sure Sonal's here somewhere, and the whole WEACT team. We are really, really lucky to have such exceptionally capable people at WEACT driving so much of our really urgent climate agenda. And I really appreciate your all emphasis and focus on heat, because heat is the #1 climate killer, right? We don't often think of it, but we know it to be true. And disproportionately, the heat deaths that occur are happening in people's homes. And so, in part inspired by the awesome team at WEACT, we've been working together with them, folks in the council and folks in the mayor's office, to work to draft legislation that we're really excited to be introducing in the not distant future. We don't have a precise timeline yet, but to mandate that homes in New York are kept cool in the summer months. You know, just like we mandate that landlords provide heat in the winter, we have to do the same in the summer to make sure that our homes are cool for people to be able to safely stay in their apartments during the hottest months of the year. The heat waves are getting worse and worse, and we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to retrofit apartments, to make sure that fans and air conditioners are available, and go far beyond the limited resources that are available to New Yorkers now. It has to be required. We're not the first folks to consider doing something like this. Policies like this are in place in really hot places like Phoenix and Dallas, and the state of Oregon. Even Chicago and DC have limited versions of this policy in effect. We're really focused on how do we both mandate cooler temperatures in people's homes, as well as provide utility assistance, so this isn't a costly burden for New York City tenants, and that we help make more resources available to finance retrofits, to make sure that we are effectively getting heat pumps and other new technology in place in people's homes, so that folks are able to survive the summer months. Like, that's the conversation that we're having to have these days. And we need a regulatory framework in place that can guarantee the safety of our neighbors, especially low-income older adults that are most at risk. And so that's the kind of sharing the early stages of I guess the previewing the legislation that we're going to be releasing later on this year. If anybody has questions or concerns or wants to talk to our team about it, Molly Haley from our team is driving the work, but in close communication with WEACT and some other great organizations. So I really appreciate the chance to say hello and to share some of the work that we're doing, and most of all, to just express gratitude to the WEACT team for their leadership on this and so many other fronts. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember Ressler. And you also raised a really good point that I don't know if I made really clear when I was presenting earlier. Making sure that we're advancing beyond air conditioning only is really important, because we know that air conditioners also contribute to sort of exacerbating climate change and the urban heat island effect, because they have I don't know if I'm getting too sciencey here, but like chlorofluorocarbons in the refrigerant systems that really heat up the air around them while they cool the apartments inside. So really thinking long-term is a really important component of that legislation and future planning for the indoor maximum temperature law. Yeah, I can wait a second if there are any more questions or comments about that.
Look like there are 2 questions in the chat related to the indoor max air temperature.
Oh yeah, okay, I see. Are folks working on this bill with HPD to consider its large affordable housing stock, and how would the HPD inspection process work? Would you be able to speak to that a little bit more, Councilmember Ressler?
Yes, we've been working mostly with the mayor's office of MOCJ, the mayor's office of environmental justice, and are very much focused on trying to ensure that we won't have financial burdens placed on tenants. The mandate is on the landlord to provide this service, and we're looking to ensure that there are financial offsets for low and moderate income tenants if necessary. The inspection process could work similarly to heat. So if you have a situation where heat isn't being provided in your home in the winter, you call 311 and HPD comes out there. Similar requirement in the summer. If your landlord's failing to provide cooling, then it's required that HPD come out and take a look, and there be the accountability associated.
Thank you. Okay. I think for the sake of time, I see that we have 10 minutes. I see 3 more questions, and I anticipate we'll get a little bit more. So I think we can move on to some other questions, but if Councilmember Ressler and his staff can stick around, at least in the chat, that would be really appreciated.
Molly is here, and she is about 1,000 times smarter than me. So you're in much better hands if she's answering questions than me. But I'm very lucky that she comes out with me and helps us do good work. So thank you, Molly, and thank you to the whole team at REACT. We really appreciate your partnership.
Thanks so much, Councilmember Ressler. All right, so I see, are there indoor temperature surveys happening to have a better sense of how much hotter programs can be, apartments can be without AC? So I'm aware of at least 2, and I see some other coalition members in the participants list. So there may be more, but I know that We Act and South Bronx Unite are undergoing a air quality study, but the air quality monitors also can measure indoor temperatures. So we're using that opportunity to kind of get a better feel for what the indoor conditions are like throughout the cooling months. And then I know that Robbie Parks at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health is also doing a study looking at indoor temperatures, and that started both in the winter and is going on through the cooling months. So there are at least 2 that I'm aware of. And if you want more information about the Columbia study, I feel free to put your interest in the chat and I can connect you to Robbie. Yeah, any others? Okay, I see some more for Councilmember Ressler's team in the chat. Let's see, can you comment on the impact of any of Adam's announcement on the extreme heat from last week? So another thing that I believe was mentioned in that announcement for NYSEM was that there is additional resources to address air quality emergencies. They are doing outreach in advance and distributing masks. In terms of extreme heat, I mean, I do think it's valuable that we have access to the cooling center map all year round, but we mentioned earlier that just knowing where they are really does not necessarily address the issues of access where there are closures or when people are actually on site, can they actually figure out where to go in the cooling centers? Is the staff prepared to address heat-related illness if someone, you know, just in the process of getting there is experiencing symptoms of heat stroke? Like, these are things that we actually need real funding for, and not just, you know, we have the map available. It's not necessarily a direct solution, but it does help people recognize what the assets in their community are, and that is a positive step. And I think it also has, in the press release, I think they also talked about safety for pets and emotional support animals, and also like which cooling centers can accommodate them. So as early as this week, like that cooling options map should be up and running for everyone to start to familiarize themselves with all of the cooling center options, as well as other spaces that are not deemed cooling centers, but have access to cooling at an accessible or free rate. I don't totally know exactly how they're coining cool options. But oh yeah, thank you. LJ put the announcement in the chat for more information. Yeah, let me know if that answered the question. In terms of the science, what information does the city have regarding the cooling distance from parks, and how far does the cooling effect of parks extend? That's a good question. I don't know that they are necessarily framing it that way, because beyond just parks, there's our urban canopy extends into our right of way through trees on the streetscape. And so street trees also offer a major cooling benefit if they're mature and provide shade and shade the buildings. And there are also a lot of other factors that contribute to cooling in a neighborhood. So I don't know that it's necessarily being framed that way scientifically by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene that develops the heat vulnerability index. But that's a good question for us to take back and sort of understand if that is, you know, how informing their approach to cooling through the expansion of the urban canopy. Let's see, did I miss any other questions? It looks like another question was addressed in the chat. The question was about the indoor max temp bill addressing weatherization. If there's cooling inside, it could be quite inefficient if there are issues like leaky windows. And Councilmember Ressler's team just let everyone know that the goal is to encourage weatherization and other efficiency improvements, but it's still in the drafting process. Yeah, any other questions? I know we only have 3 minutes. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Let's see, I'm gonna make sure to